today we aren't talking about some hypothetical war game or, abstract foreign policy. We're looking at a huge stack of raw intelligence, diplomatic cables, and military analysis showing exactly how that nightmare scenario is unfolding right now.
Yeah, we're seeing traditional levers of power, things like massive aircraft carrier strike groups, or even huge diplomatic coalitions. They're just suddenly failing to control the situation.
Right.
The whole architecture of global influence is basically being rewritten in real time.
And that is exactly why we're here. So, welcome to another deep dive. To you, the learner listening right now, we know you're looking way past the daily headlines. You want to understand the actual mechanics of this incredibly complex, fast-moving geopolitical crisis in the Middle East.
It's a lot to unpack for sure.
It really is. Now, a quick caveat before we get into this intelligence. We are looking at raw strategic data today. You are going to hear about calculations, military strikes, and actions from various nations. And this involves both left-wing and right-wing political figures, and it is all highly, highly controversial.
Very charged stuff.
Yeah. So our job today isn't to take a side or, validate some political narrative or tell you who to root for. That's not what we do. Our mission is just to look at the board, look at the math, and show you exactly how the pieces are moving and why.
Right. We are dissecting the mechanics of power. Because right now, those mechanics are just malfunctioning in ways that Western military planners simply, they didn't anticipate it.
No, they really didn't. So let's start with the baseline miscalculation. Because the intelligence briefings point to a very specific premise that kind of kicked this whole thing off.
Yeah, the initial assumption.
Right, the assumption from U.S. and allied leadership that the Iranian regime was effectively just a paper tiger. The theory was that a sharp, decisive decapitation strike against their leadership would just cause the whole structure to crumble.
And, it's a very seductive theory if you're a military planner. You assume you're dealing with a highly fragile, unpopular regime.
Right.
You assume that if you basically cut off the head of the snake, the body dies. And the populace, who we know has been incredibly dissatisfied for a long time, will just rise up and applaud the intervention.
But that fundamentally misreads how asymmetrical warfare actually works, right?
It ignores how deeply entrenched regimes operate.
Because hitting the target didn't collapse the regime at all. It triggered something the briefings call horizontal escalation. And I really want you to break that down for us because it seems to be like the main engine driving this entire global crisis.
Yeah, so to understand horizontal escalation, you first have to look at the traditional alternative, which is vertical escalation.
Okay.
If two conventional armies are fighting and one drops a 500-pound bomb, the other drops a 1,000-pound bomb.
They just keep upping the ante.
Right. You escalate vertically. You increase the sheer force and destructive power in that exact same theater. But Iran knew it couldn't survive a vertical escalation ladder with the United States. I mean, they don't have the stealth bombers or the sheer tonnage of munitions.
So they basically changed the geometry of the war.
Precisely. Horizontal escalation means that when the U.S. strikes a target in Tehran, Iran doesn't try to, shoot down an American jet in Iranian airspace.
They don't fight force with force.
Right. Instead, they activate this vast decentralized network. Suddenly, a precision drone strikes a U.S. base in Iraq. Then another one hits a commercial vessel in the Red Sea. Another targets an oil facility in a neighboring Gulf state.
Wow.
They expand the surface area of the conflict so widely and so fast that a conventional superpower just can't possibly defend every single node.
And that horizontal explosion, it immediately shattered this delicate balance of power that had existed in the region. If we look at the intelligence landscape right before this escalation, what the analysts refer to as the February 27th baseline, the U.S. had spent years building this massive counterbalancing coalition against Iran.
The Gulf Cooperative Council.
Exactly, the GCC. We're talking Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar.
Right, and the underlying dynamic of that entire coalition was fundamentally transactional. The United States acted as the absolute guarantor of security.
The ultimate shield.
Yeah, and analysts often compare it to a mafia boss dynamic, and I mean that in the purely structural sense of a protection racket.
Okay, how?
Well, the boss provides an ironclad guarantee of safety.
Yeah.
And in exchange, the various families, in this case the Gulf states, they fall in line. They allow the boss to operate in their territory, and they coordinate against the rival syndicate.
Which is exactly why the U.S. had these massive, sprawling, highly visible military bases scattered across Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. Like, they were basically giant billboards projecting American power.
Yeah, they were designed for peacetime deterrence.
Yeah.
Above-ground barracks, massive visible airstrips, these huge centralized command centers.
Right.
But in a scenario of horizontal escalation, those highly visible platforms transition instantly. They go from being assets to just massive liabilities.
Because Iran didn't attack with, like, F-14 fighter jets. The raw intelligence shows they unleashed this deeply buried arsenal of really cheap, highly precise drones, and they targeted those exact above-ground U.S. bases, and, crucially, they hit the infrastructure of the allied Arab states hosting them.
Right. And Iran's strategy there wasn't just to inflict damage. It was to prove a political point.
Which way?
By penetrating the airspace and hitting those bases, they were sending a very clear message to the Gulf states. Basically saying, look, the United States cannot even protect its own soldiers from our drone swarms. How on earth are they going to protect your vulnerable oil refineries?
Man. So the Gulf states realized their ironclad American insurance policy is actually full of holes.
Exactly.
And the U.S. response to this vulnerability is what the Pentagon called the burden-sharing doctrine, which this logic is just fascinating to me. The U.S. deliberately deploys a limited naval force, fully expecting Iran to retaliate by attacking American allies in the Gulf.
Yep.
The theory was that this shared pain would force Saudi Arabia and the UAE to finally, step up, share the burden of the war, and actively fight Iran alongside the U.S. It sounds like these Gulf states were paying premiums for an ironclad U.S. insurance policy, but the moment the house caught fire, the insurance company told them to grab a bucket and defend themselves.
That's a perfect analogy. It's basically an application of Cold War logic to a modern asymmetrical conflict, and it failed spectacularly.
I mean, how did that realization change their behavior?
Well, the burden-sharing doctrine assumed these nations had almost no agency, that they were simply proxies who would fight when pushed. But you really have to look at the mechanism of their economies.
Right, the oil.
Exactly. These nations rely entirely on the safe extraction and export of oil. A prolonged kinetic war with a neighbor who possesses tens of thousands of suicide drones, that is an existential threat to their actual survival.
So instead of fighting, the whole coalition just shatters. The diplomatic cables show this anti-Iran alliance instantly breaking into 3 distinct pools of self-preservation.
And the speed of the fragmentation was just breathtaking. Let's look at the first pool, the states actively distancing themselves. Iraq is the prime example here.
Okay.
Remember the historical context. The U.S. dismantled the Iraqi government in 2003 and spent trillions rebuilding it. You would assume deep alignment there.
Right, you'd think they'd be locked in.
But the moment the drones started flying, the Iraqi leadership looked at the U.S. bases on their soil and realized they were just magnets for Iranian munitions.
Yeah.
So they are now actively maneuvering to expel the U.S. military presence.
Wow.
They're sliding much closer to Iran's political orbit, basically just to avoid being collateral damage.
Okay, then you have the second pool, the hedgers.
Right. The hedgers are playing pure survival politics. Qatar, for instance, hosts the Al Udeid Air Base, which is the largest U.S. military facility in the Middle East.
Huge base.
Massive.
Yeah.
But diplomatically, they're keeping their heads down. They're communicating through back channels to Tehran that they want absolutely no part in this escalation.
Just staying out of the crossfire.
Exactly. And Oman is going even further. They are historically a neutral mediator, but they are now actively entertaining proposals to share toll revenues from the Strait of Hormuz with Iran.
Wait, sharing tolls?
Yeah, effectively validating Iran's control over the waterway in exchange for a cut of the profits and immunity from attack.
Unbelievable. And that brings us to the third pool, which honestly seems like an absolute nightmare for U.S. grand strategy. The states seeking new protectors, Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Yeah, these are the nations with the absolute most to lose. Their wealth is tied up in highly vulnerable above-ground desalination plants, oil refineries, luxury real estate.
Sitting ducks, basically.
Exactly. So when the U.S. told them to share the burden and defend themselves, they didn't gear up for war. They went shopping for a new mafia boss. And the intelligence indicates Saudi Arabia recently inked a major security arrangement with Pakistan.
Which fundamentally changes the nuclear arithmetic of the whole region. Because Pakistan isn't just a military power, they are a nuclear-armed state.
Yes, and a state with a very complex, historically cooperative relationship with Tehran.
Really?
Yeah, Pakistan actually assisted in the early days of Iran's nuclear enrichment program decades ago.
Yeah.
So by bypassing Washington and aligning with Islamabad, Saudi Arabia is basically bringing a nuclear umbrella into the Gulf that the United States does not control.
And one that has an open line of communication to Iran.
Exactly. It is a total collapse of American security architecture in the region.
Man. So let's follow the thread of cause and effect here. The U.S. tries to force its allies to fight. The allies say, no thanks, and back away. That means Iran suddenly finds itself with zero local resistance along its coastline.
None.
Which gives them total, unopposed access to the water right in front of them, the Strait of Hormuz. So what happens when a nation with thousands of deeply buried drones suddenly has unchallenged dominion over the world's most critical energy choke point?
You get the institution of an asymmetrical blockade. And this is where we really have to look past the military hardware and understand the mechanisms of global finance, specifically the maritime insurance market.
Because Iran isn't like lining up naval destroyers to physically block every supertanker. I mean, they don't even have the Navy for that.
They don't need a navy, they just need fear. Look, through the Strait of Hormuz flows roughly 20% of the world's daily oil consumption. These commercial supertankers are colossal investments. The ship itself is worth tens of millions, and the cargo is worth hundreds of millions. They cannot sail without comprehensive insurance, specifically what's called war risk premiums, which are underwritten largely by syndicates in London.
So how does Iran weaponize that insurance market?
By demonstrating selective lethality. Iran launches a few cheap, like $20,000 drones and strikes a tanker affiliated with a Western nation.
Okay.
The moment that happens, the actuaries in London run the math. The war risk premium for a single voyage through the strait spikes from a tiny fraction of a percent to 3, 4, or even 5% of the vessel's total value.
Oh, wow. And suddenly the voyage costs millions of dollars more just in insurance.
Exactly, to the point where it just becomes economically unviable to sail. The shipping companies halt operations. Iran doesn't have to physically stop the ships, they just make the water way too expensive to navigate.
That is wild.
But the brilliance of the strategy, and honestly the terror of it, is that the blockade is selective. Iran communicates that if a nation plays by their rules, distances itself from the U.S., and pays the necessary tolls, their ships are granted safe passage.
Which completely reorients the geopolitics of Asia, because we often have this very Western-centric view that, oh, Middle Eastern oil is all flowing to Europe or the U.S.
Right, but it's not.
No. The data shows 80 to 90% of the oil transiting Hormuz goes directly to Asian superpowers.
It is the industrial artery of the East.
Yeah.
Let's examine India's position, for example. Historically, you might expect New Delhi to partner with Washington to secure freedom of navigation. They have strong ties. They're part of the Quad Alliance.
Sure.
But India is flatly refusing to side with the U.S. military coalition against Iran.
Because it's the difference between a tax hike and a heart attack.
That is the precise economic reality.
Yeah.
If oil goes up $50 a barrel because of a supply disruption somewhere in the world, that's a massive tax hike.
Right.
It causes inflation, it hurts the Indian consumer, but the economy adapts and survives. But if the Strait of Hormuz is closed to ships bound for India, that isn't a price fluctuation. It's a physiological block. It is an economic heart attack.
Like, if you're dying of thirst in the desert, you'll pay $1,000 for a bottle of water. That's inflation. But if there is literally no water to buy, you just die. For India, this isn't just about paying more at the pump. It's about the absolute loss of supply, shutting down their entire industrial capacity. The industrial organs simply stop receiving oxygen.
Beautifully put. Without that massive daily influx of crude oil, India's power grids fail. Their manufacturing sector shuts down. Their agricultural logistics just freeze. They would fall off an economic cliff in a matter of weeks.
Wow.
The leadership in New Delhi understands they cannot take a principled pro-American stand if it means their country goes dark. They are forced into strict neutrality or even leaning toward Iranian alignment simply to keep the lights on.
And we see this exact same mechanism force an incredible diplomatic confrontation with Japan. The intelligence details a meeting in the Oval Office that is just, honestly, staggering to read.
It's a profound demonstration of the limits of American leverage. So the U.S. president brought the head of state of Japan into the Oval Office, and the objective was to aggressively browbeat Tokyo into joining a multinational military force to secure the strait and push back on Iran.
And she refused, like, right to the president's face.
She did. She looked at the absolute energy dependency of her nation. Japan has virtually no domestic energy resources. They rely almost entirely on maritime imports.
Right.
She recognized that aligning with the U.S. military meant Iran would instantly designate Japanese tankers as legitimate targets. The insurance would vanish, the oil would stop, and Japan would be completely paralyzed.
So she chose economic survival over the post-World War II military alliance with the United States.
Exactly. She actively distanced Japan from American policy.
And Iran knows exactly how much leverage they've harvested here. Like, they aren't just reacting to events, they are trying to institutionalize this new power dynamic. The diplomatic cables reveal a proposed 10-point plan from Tehran. Break down the mechanics of this proposal because it reads less like a peace treaty and more like a hostile takeover of regional security.
Yeah, it is a brilliant, audacious declaration of a new regional order. The 10-point plan offers an end to immediate hostilities, a permanent ceasefire, and a halt to U.S. strikes.
Okay.
But the concessions they demand in return effectively dismantle American hegemony. The most striking element is the proposal to charge a $2 million toll per commercial ship transiting the Strait of Hormuz.
Which they cleverly offered to share with Oman to buy their diplomatic cover, like you mentioned earlier.
Right. They are demanding war reparations from the West. They are asserting their sovereign right to enrich uranium. And what you really have to understand is the historical precedent here.
What do you mean?
For the last 80 years, the global superpower, the United States, has dictated the rules of the sea, ensuring free navigation. By instituting a toll and selectively blocking an international strait, Iran is basically declaring the era of American naval dominance in the Persian Gulf is over. We set the rules of commerce now.
It's Iran announcing itself as a fourth center of world power, right alongside the US, Russia, and China. And if you extrapolate those four powers out into a macroeconomic endgame, the intelligence points to a scenario that absolutely terrifies Western economists. It revolves around the China-Russia-Iran axis.
You really have to look at the sheer volume of hydrocarbons controlled by that axis. Iran controls roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. Russia controls around 11%.
That's massive.
It is. If these nations, facing intense Western sanctions, decide to coordinate their economic warfare, they have the capacity to pull 30% of the global oil supply off the open market.
But wait, they wouldn't just stop pumping it, right? Because their own economies would just collapse.
No, they don't have to stop pumping it. They just reroute it entirely outside the dollar-dominated global system.
Oh, I see.
They enter into tacit or formal agreements to let China absorb that massive supply at a steep discount, settling transactions in yuan or through barter systems.
Leaving the Western economy completely starved for energy.
Exactly. It would trigger catastrophic inflation across Europe and North America. It spikes bond yields, crushes consumer spending, and forces governments to make draconian cuts to social programs just to manage the debt.
Wow.
All while simultaneously fueling the industrial engine of their primary geopolitical rival, China, with cheap, guaranteed energy. It is essentially a blueprint for the managed decline of the American-led global economy, all orchestrated through the control of a 33-kilometer stretch of water.
I want to pause here because we've been talking about massive geopolitical shifts, right? Insurance markets, global inflation, superpowers, trading percentages of global oil. But the actual physical tactics being discussed to break this Iranian leverage are creating an unimaginable nightmare for the human beings caught in the crossfire.
It's grim.
Let's examine the humanitarian reality of the military campaigns being proposed.
This is where the abstract chess game translates into a very grim, granular reality.
Yeah.
The intelligence highlights specific rhetoric from U.S. leadership, explicit threats to send the country, quote, back to the Stone Ages.
Wow.
There is a stated intent to, quote, end a civilization in one night.
Now, rhetoric is one thing, but the military briefings actually detail the specific targeting strategies designed to achieve that. And it centers entirely on the civilian infrastructure, specifically the power grid.
Right.
How does the Iranian electrical grid function, and why is it so vulnerable to this kind of systematic destruction?
Well, modern electrical grids are incredibly fragile networks. The Iranian system relies on roughly 130 major interconnected nodes to distribute power across a vast, very mountainous country. Military engineers understand that you don't need to bomb every single substation and power line to turn the lights off. You map the network, identify the critical bottlenecks, and if you precisely target and destroy just the top 10 central nodes, you trigger a cascading failure that trips the breakers nationwide.
The entire grid goes down.
The whole thing.
But the briefings make a really terrifying, highly technical distinction about what exactly is being targeted within those top 10 nodes. They differentiate between hitting the transformers and hitting the generating hulls, the turbines themselves. Walk us through that mechanism because it dictates the entire scale of the humanitarian disaster.
Yeah, the difference is literally measured in hundreds of thousands of human lives. If an airstrike targets the transformers, which is the equipment that steps the voltage up or down for transmission, you knock the power out for a few weeks.
Okay.
It's highly disruptive, people suffer, hospitals scramble for generator fuel, but it is fundamentally repairable. You can patch a transformer network.
But that's not what the Stone Age strategy calls for.
No, not at all. The explicit threat being evaluated involves using precision munitions to penetrate the facilities and destroy the generating hulls. These are the colossal custom-built turbines at the very heart of the power plants.
Wow.
We're talking about 50-ton pieces of bespoke metallurgy.
Yeah, you don't just order a replacement on Amazon for that.
Exactly. There are no backups sitting in a warehouse somewhere.
Yeah.
Every single turbine is custom engineered for the specific thermodynamic profile of that exact power plant.
Oh, man.
Only few companies in the world like Siemens or GE even have the industrial capacity to forge them. And crucially, under a strict regime of Western sanctions, Iran cannot legally purchase them.
So even if they had the billions of dollars required, the supply chain is just completely locked down.
Completely. And even if they turn to China or Russia to manufacture them, the sheer logistics of designing, forging, testing, and transporting 50-ton turbines into a heavily bombarded war zone, I mean, you are looking at an absolute minimum timeline of 6 to 18 months to replace them.
Which means 6 to 18 months with zero power for a nation of 92 million people.
Yes.
Let's actually walk through the physiological reality of what happens to a modern society when the electricity is shut off for a year.
The collapse happens in very distinct, predictable phases. The very first system to fail is healthcare. Modern medicine is entirely dependent on a continuous flow of electricity.
Right.
Within hours of the grid collapsing, backup generators at hospitals begin to run out of diesel. Dialysis machines across the country simply shut off, condemning hundreds of thousands of patients with kidney failure to toxic shock.
Oh my God.
Life-saving surgeries become impossible. Premature babies in neonatal incubators lose thermal regulation. The immediate localized death toll inside medical facilities would be staggering within just the first 48 hours.
Then you hit the second phase, which is the food logistics chain.
And we aren't just talking about the food in your home refrigerator spoiling. We're talking about the complete failure of the national industrial cold chain.
Right, the mass storage.
Exactly. Massive refrigeration warehouses that store the nation's perishable agricultural output fail. The meat, the dairy, the fresh produce. The country's entire food reserve spoils in a matter of days. You transition a country of 92 million from a functional modern society into profound nationwide famine almost instantly.
And without power, you don't have water pressure either.
Exactly. Municipal water pumps fail, desalination plants shut down, sanitation and sewage treatment plants require massive amounts of electricity to process waste. When they stop, sewage backs up into the streets and contaminates the groundwater.
So you have a starving, severely malnourished population that is suddenly forced to drink untreated, contaminated water.
Yes. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid run rampant. The military briefings explicitly calculate that executing this strategy would lower the national life expectancy of Iran by several measurable years. It is basically a blueprint for man-made famine and plague.
Wait, I have to challenge the fundamental strategic logic here. If I read standard military doctrine, the whole point of these maximum pressure or infrastructure campaigns is psychological, right?
That's the theory, yes.
The theory is that if you make life utterly unbearable for the civilian population, they will direct their anger at their own government and overthrow the dictator. Why wouldn't this Stone Age strategy cause the Iranian people to just rise up and dismantle the regime for the U.S.?
Because that theory almost always fails in practice. It ignores the deep sociological reality of threat perception and human psychology.
How so?
Well, before this massive escalation, the intelligence confirms there was a robust, highly active pro-democracy movement in Iran. Just a few years ago, we saw massive street protests where an estimated 30,000 Iranians were killed or imprisoned by the radical regime.
Right. They violently opposed their own government. So wouldn't an American bombing campaign just give them the push they need to finish the revolution?
No, because the vector of the existential threat changes instantly. When a foreign superpower threatens genocidal intent, when a U.S. president publicly threatens to end your civilization in one night, the psychology of the populace shifts from seeking political reform to seeking basic biological survival.
You stop protesting the dictator and you start looking for a shield.
Exactly. We have to contextualize the threat. The U.S. maintains an arsenal of Minuteman, 3 intercontinental ballistic missiles. The intelligence reminds us that these carry 100 to 300 kiloton warheads, many times more powerful than Hiroshima.
What?
They can be retargeted and launched in 45 minutes. When the average Iranian citizen, even the pro-democracy activist, realizes that level of apocalyptic power is pointed directly at their cities, their children, their power grid, their entire existence.
They realize that civil disobedience won't save them from a nuclear strike.
Right. And the only thing that can save them from an American nuclear threat is an Iranian nuclear deterrent.
Wow. It creates a perverse psychological bonding.
It does. Out of sheer terror, the civilians are driven right into the arms of the radical regime. The U.S. military actions are achieving the exact opposite of their intended strategic goal.
Instead of fracturing the regime, the infrastructure targeting is solidifying the government's domestic control.
Exactly. It's completely crushing the pro-democracy movement, and it's accelerating massive, widespread public support for Iran to aggressively push for a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
They view it as the only viable insurance policy against annihilation.
The tragic irony is just overwhelming. The attempt to project power and force compliance is actually destroying American influence and manufacturing the exact nuclear threat it was supposed to prevent.
It's a strategic disaster.
So if the military force is so clearly backfiring, both strategically and humanely, why hasn't diplomacy worked? We constantly hear about back-channel talks, ceasefires, and peace plans. Why do they inevitably fall apart?
That brings us to the diplomatic sabotage. To understand why the peace process continually fails, we have to examine the profound asymmetry of goals between the United States and its closest regional ally, Israel.
What does the intelligence tell us about those divergent goals?
Well, the United States, looking at the fragmenting coalition in the Gulf, the terrifying economic blowback in Asia, and the domestic political costs of rising inflation, they ultimately want an off-ramp. They want to stabilize the global economy, secure the energy markets, and de-escalate.
But Israel's objective is fundamentally different.
According to the strategic assessments, Israel's goal is not stabilization, it is the total decimation of the Iranian regime.
Wow.
They view Iran's deeply buried capabilities and proxy networks as an intolerable existential threat to their borders. They want a permanent restructuring of the regional power dynamic.
So they aren't looking for a pause.
No, and because of this misalignment, whenever the U.S. gets close to securing a diplomatic off-ramp, Israel views that American diplomatic success as a direct threat to its own strategic survival.
And the diplomatic cables show a jaw-dropping pattern where Israeli military operations seem deliberately timed to blow up American negotiations. Let's trace the timeline of these events, starting with the 12-day war back in June.
The sequence of events in June is highly revealing. The U.S. president, seeking to de-escalate the conflict, publicly announced that his administration was opening direct back-channel negotiations with a specific, pragmatic faction of Iranian officials. The goal was to establish a framework for a ceasefire.
And what happened?
Exactly 36 hours after the president's announcement, Israeli air power executed a highly complex, targeted assassination strike inside Iranian territory. And the targets they killed were those exact same Iranian negotiators the U.S. was preparing to meet with.
You have got to be kidding me.
The diplomatic off-ramp was physically vaporized before the first meeting could even occur.
Man. Then we fast forward to the February 28th escalation, which fundamentally expanded the scope of the war.
Yeah, February 28th is a critical inflection point. The intelligence shows the U.S. was quietly making significant progress with what analysts call the Iranian dubs.
The moderates.
Right, the moderate, pragmatic elements within the regime's leadership who wanted to avoid a wider war to protect the Iranian economy.
The faction that might actually agree to a deal.
Yes. But just as those delicate negotiations were reaching a breakthrough, Israel launched a massive unilateral decapitation strike against the Iranian supreme leader. They killed him, along with dozens of the exact moderate officials who were advocating for the American peace deal.
Which completely boxes the United States in.
It forced America's hand entirely. By launching an uncoordinated strike of that magnitude, Israel guaranteed an overwhelming Iranian retaliation.
Right.
The U.S. military suddenly had to scramble its air assets and launch a massive defense campaign simply to protect its own exposed bases in Iraq and the Gulf from the inevitable blowback.
So the diplomacy was shattered and the U.S. was dragged forcefully deeper into the kinetic shooting war.
Exactly.
But the most blatant, documented example of this dynamic is the assassination of Ali Larijani on March 17th.
Yeah, Larijani was the linchpin of the peace process. He was the primary Iranian contact negotiating the terms of that 10-point peace proposal we discussed earlier.
The one with the tolls.
Right. The U.S. president had reviewed the terms and publicly stated that the proposal was, quote, workable. It was the closest the world had come to stepping back from the brink.
And Israel killed him.
In a targeted airstrike. And the frustration in Washington was palpable. The U.S. president actually broke protocol and went on social media to vent his anger.
Wow.
He publicly complained that Israel's lone wolf actions had completely reset the clock right when he was inches away from the biggest deal in history.
Okay, stop right there, because this raises a massive structural question. How is a smaller regional ally able to consistently force the hand of the ultimate global superpower?
This is a great question.
Like, how does the United States get repeatedly blindsided and dragged into escalations it explicitly doesn't want?
The answer is hidden in the architecture of intelligence collection. We really have to look at the historical attrition of the CIA over the last 2 decades.
Okay, what happened there?
Following the global war on terror, the CIA pivoted heavily toward counterterrorism, paramilitary operations, drone strikes in Afghanistan and Iraq. And as a result, they severely neglected their traditional deep-cover human intelligence networks, human in hard target, denied states like Iran.
So they lost their own independent eyes and ears on the ground?
Exactly. The intelligence assessments reveal a shocking vulnerability. The United States relies on foreign intelligence services for up to 65% of its actionable intelligence regarding Iran.
65%?
Yes. And the country that holds the absolute monopoly on robust, high-level human intelligence inside Tehran is Israel. Israel maintained Iran as its primary existential focus while the U.S. was distracted elsewhere.
So if you are the U.S. president and you are getting the majority of your intelligence from an ally who wants a completely different geopolitical outcome than you do, they essentially control your reality.
They absolutely do.
If you're getting all your intelligence from an ally who wants a different outcome, they can selectively feed you the intelligence that justifies a preemptive strike, while quietly withholding the intelligence that shows the Iranian doves are ready to sign a peace treaty. It's the ultimate case of the tail wagging the dog.
It is a profound structural vulnerability. When a superpower lacks independent verification, it becomes a hostage to the agenda of its intelligence provider. You cannot execute an independent foreign policy if you don't control the data that policy is based on.
That makes total sense.
And this chaos is being actively exacerbated by a controversial structural change made by the U.S. executive branch regarding how the military actually operates.
You're talking about the blurring of Title 10 and Title 50. Break down what those legal frameworks actually mean, because it seems to be like breaking the traditional rules of engagement.
It is fundamentally altering the accountability of American military power. So, in U.S. law, Title 10 governs traditional military operations. When the Department of Defense acts under Title 10, there's public visibility, there are recognized uniforms, the laws of armed conflict apply.
And oversight, right.
Crucially, yes, there is strict congressional oversight. It is the framework for conventional war.
And Title 50.
Title 50 governs the intelligence apparatus, primarily covert action by the CIA. These are deniable, secret operations. The president signs a highly classified finding. Only a select group of congressional leaders, the Gang of Eight, are briefed, and the U.S. government can officially deny any involvement.
So what does the intelligence show the president has done with these two distinct frameworks?
The reports indicate the executive branch has effectively merged them.
Merged them.
Yes. The president is taking the massive, overwhelming kinetic power of Title 10 military assets, F-35 stealth fighters, carrier strike groups, cyber warfare divisions, and deploying them with the total secrecy, deniability, and lack of congressional oversight of a Title 50 covert operation.
Wow. He's running the world's most powerful conventional military, like a shadow agency.
Yes, and the strategic fallout is disastrous. When you combine this lack of transparency with the selectively shared, highly biased intelligence from regional allies, you get unprecedented, unpredictable military strikes. American foreign policy loses all predictability.
And if you are an adversary or even an ally, you have no idea who is actually calling the shots, what the rules of engagement are, or what triggers an American response. It makes diplomacy impossible because no one knows what the actual parameters of the conflict even are.
Exactly. It replaces a structured, predictable global order with chaotic, localized tactical strikes driven by opaque intelligence and hidden agendas.
Man. Okay, let's step back and synthesize the massive scope of the intelligence we've unpacked today. We started this deep dive looking at a military map, expecting to see clean lines, precision targeting, and predictable outcomes. Instead, we found a labyrinth of unintended consequences.
A total labyrinth.
We've seen how a single attempt to project power through a decapitation strike fundamentally backfired, unleashing horizontal escalation that unraveled the entire American security coalition in the Middle East, fracturing allies into desperate pools of self-preservation and pushing Saudi Arabia toward a nuclear-armed Pakistan.
And we tracked how that vacuum of power handed Iran unopposed control over the Strait of Hormuz, where they are weaponizing the maritime insurance market with cheap drones to institute an asymmetrical blockade.
Right.
A blockade so devastating it is forcing massive Asian economies like India and Japan to abandon the U.S. and reorient their entire geopolitics just to prevent an economic heart attack.
Then we confronted the horrifying clinical reality of infrastructure targeting. We saw how destroying custom-built 50-ton generating turbines isn't just about turning the lights off. It's a blueprint for collapsing the healthcare and food logistics of a modern nation, threatening 92 million civilians with man-made famine. And we saw the psychological blowback of that threat, perversely driving a pro-democracy populace to bond with a radical regime in a desperate plea for a nuclear deterrent against American missiles.
And finally, we exposed the backstage diplomatic sabotage. We examined how repeated American attempts to secure a peace deal have been physically destroyed by Israeli-targeted assassination.
Right, the loss of control.
We saw the profound vulnerability of a superpower relying on a smaller ally for 65% of its intelligence, allowing its foreign policy to be manipulated, all while the executive branch blurs the lines of military oversight into a chaotic shadow war.
To you, the learner, listening to this deep dive right now, this is exactly why we look past the headlines, because this isn't just distant foreign policy happening on a map halfway across the world. This is the architecture of the reality you live in.
Absolutely.
The asymmetrical blockade in Hormuz directly dictates the maritime insurance premiums that determine the price of the goods on your local shelves. The shifting alliances in Asia dictate the inflation rates and bond yields that impact your savings. We're watching in real time the profound realization that traditional measures of power, like a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier strike group, are being rendered obsolete overnight by cheap, buried drones, selectively shared intelligence, and shifting geopolitical loyalties.
It forces a total reevaluation of what power actually means in the 21st century. And I really want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you watch the news this week.
Okay, let's hear it.
We've spent the last hour dissecting the incredible complexity of this conflict. But look at the big picture. If the ultimate global superpower can have its foreign policy consistently hijacked by a rogue ally's targeted assassinations, and if its massive unparalleled navy can be held hostage by inexpensive, deeply buried drones controlling a narrow strait, are we witnessing the end of the superpower era altogether? In a world where asymmetrical warfare, decentralized alliances, and toll-charging blockades dictate the rules of the global economy, perhaps true global dominance is no longer physically or economically possible for any single nation.
It's a sobering paradigm shift. That expectation of clean, precise engineering in global affairs, it's an illusion. And the murky waters we are navigating are much deeper and much more turbulent than anyone anticipated. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives, demand to see the mechanisms behind the headlines, and we will see you next time.